Author is funded by the Pacific Northwest Writers Association, supporting writers from pen to publication since 1955. To learn more about the PNWA and their yearly conference, please go to pnwa.org. Hi, this is Bill Kenower for Author Magazine, and today I'm in Seattle, Washington with Claudia Rowe, author of The Spider and the Fly. Claudia, welcome to Author.
Bill, thank you so much for having me. It's a really great pleasure to talk with you.
So, Claudia, normally for these conversations, sometimes we don't talk about the book itself that much, but I think for this particular conversation, we're going to have to. And so I'm going to do something a little unusual. Would you be willing to, for the viewers, give a quick summary of what The Spider and the Fly is about?
Sure. I was a young reporter in upstate New York, and a man had just confessed to murdering 8 women and keeping their bodies in his home, where he lived with his mom and his dad and his sister. And for various reasons, I thought, you are going to be able to give me the answer that I've been after for years as a reporter.
Why do people do these things?
How do you get there?
How do you get from being a baby to that?
How do you cross the line? What is it to cross the line? And how do you understand yourself? How do people who do these things think about themselves? Kind of what I was really after, what is the mechanism of cruelty?
Right.
That's where it started. And then, as I began to pursue it as a reporter, I couldn't help but notice a few things. First of all, the subject-writer relationship, the subject-interviewer relationship, was increasingly starting to seem like predator-prey relationship.
Because you were actually meeting this man and having conversations with him and writing letters to him. You weren't just reporting on him, but
right.
You were...
I was getting closer and closer, and I was sort of in pursuit of him and his riddles. Then, as I got deeper into it, I had to be honest about why I was even doing this. In my attempt to trace his journey, I ended up changing my own.
Well, one of the really interesting things about this book is that it's a kind of hybrid in that it's a memoir ultimately. However, it also is a journalistic, what I would think of as there are aspects of it that are a more traditional journalistic narrative, a fact-based narrative about people other than yourself, whereas traditionally the memoir only follows themselves. But that was just organic, I assume, or did you think about it and say, this is the way I want to do it?
You know, no. At the time, it just seemed, this is the story. Like I said, I had begun it as a purely journalistic endeavor, a very traditional journalistic endeavor, but for various reasons, as you encountered in reading the story, that wasn't going to happen, because I wasn't going to be able to get the kind of A plus B equals C kind of equation and the kind of neat, tidy answers that journalism kind of trades in.
Right.
It was a much more murky
Well, you couldn't get yourself out of it. I mean, the idea that, because the idea behind the journalist is that you're simply the neutral observer.
But my subject was having none of it. My subject wouldn't allow that. And because I was so rabid to get in his head and to understand this, I kind of made a deal. I mean, he said, well, we can talk, but you're going to have to tell me who you are. And I was so intent upon getting who he was that I was willing to agree to a lot more than you do when pursuing a traditional news story.
And, you know, I think it's true of everybody I know who tells their story. And I know it's true of me. I think at the times in my life where I was struggling the most and most unhappy and like I wish anything were happening but this, that is my gold for everything I'm doing now. But you were at a pretty dark place there in that treehouse and in that little apartment.
Pretty dark place. A pretty dark and...
About view of yourself in a way.
Pretty dark place, pretty frozen place. I think that the self-loathing that so many writers know was very true for me, but it was very true for him as well. I felt that the issue of self-loathing was, again, something, he was like this caricature of so many things that I recognized in myself writ large. This sense of alienation, this sense of being lost and ugly and everything wrong about you. He felt that magnified.
Which brings me to what I think is one of the central questions of this book. I think a lot of the central questions that people like Kendall bring up in all of us, which is the question of the monster. And is the monster a monster wearing a human costume, beneath which is something totally different than you or me, or simply someone with certain aspects amplified dramatically, something that exists in you and exists in me, but exaggerated to such extremes that it looks foreign?
I don't think Kendall Francois was born to be a serial killer. I really don't believe that. I think some people may be born with certain predilections. I don't think that he was that person. I really felt, after talking and corresponding with him for 5 years, that this was a person who had become twisted,
Right.
and that the monster sort of grew, that he torqued in a way.
Yeah.
I think I try to show in the book, there were certainly red flags and odd things in his childhood. I think he was a very, very shy kid.
Yeah.
I also had been a very, very shy kid. I think he felt deeply alienated from the very kind of white bread community where he was
They
living.
really were. They could have been in a different community, but they went there instead.
Right. I also felt very alienated from this kind of New York City bourgeois private school world,
Right.
where I had sort of landed. I felt utterly apart from that. There were many, many things that I recognized. Also, certain tendencies toward paranoia, certain, and as I said, self-loathing. All of that in him was writ large, was enormous, and he
Right.
was physically enormous.
Yeah.
So the issue of the monster, I don't know that I ever felt I was a monster, but I felt, we're all of us kind of points on a continuum. And I did feel that he wasn't completely some unrecognizable alien. He wasn't at all. He was the saddest parts of us.
I think it's not unusual for a person at their darkest hour, if your darkest moment, to wonder, what's wrong with me? What if this life that doesn't feel like, because you write about success and the sense of failure and success, which I think haunts a lot of writers from in all different stages. And we look at the monsters and think, well, something's wrong with him. Maybe something could be wrong with me. Who's to say that I could escape that fate?
I felt that I had been sort of raised to ascend to a certain position through a certain kind of education, and I thought all these friends and acquaintances from my childhood who were in fact ascending, and yet there was I, kind of this hermit in the woods, and why
Right.
couldn't I put it together? I did have that, and was I some sort of alien that I couldn't kind of do it?
Right.
I don't really feel that way anymore, but yeah, I felt that way, and I know he did.
Yeah.
I know he felt sort of lost in a world where he couldn't enact himself. He couldn't be who he wanted to be.
What did you learn writing this book that you didn't know about either yourself or the subject before you wrote it, until you wrote it?
I learned compassion, not so much for him and who he was in his most ugly, battering sense. I learned compassion from my parents.
Yeah.
I learned compassion for cruelties that were done to me as a kid. And in that sense, I felt that I learned to see who he might have been had things been different in his life, in his family, in his education, in the community he grew up in. I learned that the cruel person is very often the aching person. So I learned a kind of empathy that I did not have at the start.
Claudia, I have one more question for you. What I want you to do is finish this sentence for me. If writing just writing, all the writing you've done, has taught you anything, it's taught you what?
Compassion. We are all struggling, all people. No matter the greatest successes, the most abject failures, or terrible monsters, all people, I believe Donald Trump, all people struggle.
Yeah.
I don't know, a lot of people have said, really? Can you find compassion for Donald Trump? I don't know. Maybe that's the next horizon. But I surely believe that he had clearly a brutal childhood of some sort. And I believe all people struggle. And compassion is not feeling sorry for someone.
No.
Compassion is recognizing the human struggle. And I do think that's what writing has taught me.